I thought it was just another flight, until the woman telling me to fasten my seatbelt became the one who made my heart race faster than the plane itself. The cabin lights were soft and golden, casting a glow over rows of quiet passengers finding their places. I slid into my seat by the window, still shaking off the rush of the airport. Planes always made me restless. Too many strangers crammed together, too much silence broken only by the low hum of the engines. I was buckling in when I noticed her. She moved down the aisle with effortless composure, her uniform crisp, her steps steady even as people shuffled bags into overhead bins. She wasn't the kind of woman who tried to be noticed, but everything about her presence drew the eye anyway. Her hair was pulled back neatly, a few strands softening her face, and there was a quiet confidence in the way she carried herself, as if she belonged not just to the plane, but to the sky itself. When she reached my row, she stopped. Her voice was calm but firm, the kind that left no room for debate. "Sir, please fasten your seatbelt." Something in me, maybe nerves, maybe the way her eyes lingered for just a fraction longer than usual, made me answer differently than I should have. I smiled up at her and said lightly, "Only if you sit beside me." For half a second, the mask slipped. A spark flickered in her expression, surprise, maybe amusement, before she caught herself, returning to that professional calm. But her eyes gave her away. There was a glimmer there, the kind that tells you someone heard your words and let them land, even if they pretended not to. She tilted her head slightly, lips curving into the faintest smile. "Seatbelts are mandatory, not optional," she replied smoothly. Yet her voice carried a softness, as though my little rebellion had warmed her more than it should have. I fastened the belt obediently, and she nodded in satisfaction. But as she stepped away, I caught the smallest pause, the way her gaze drifted back toward me for an instant before she moved on to the next passenger. The hum of the cabin filled the silence again, but I was no longer restless. That single exchange had changed the air around me. It wasn't just the playful words. It was the way they lingered between us, the way her composure faltered just enough to reveal there was more beneath the uniform, more than the practiced smile. I leaned back in my seat, watching her move further down the aisle, answering passengers with efficiency and care. But to me, she no longer seemed like just another flight attendant. She was a woman with layers, confident, graceful, yet maybe carrying a hidden softness that few ever noticed. And in that moment, with the engines rumbling beneath us, I couldn't shake the feeling that this flight would be unlike any I'd taken before. Because for the first time in a long while, I found myself hoping that a stranger might not stay a stranger. The plane leveled off, the city lights shrinking into a scattered glow beneath the clouds. The seatbelt sign dimmed, and passengers shifted into their routines, some scrolling through phones, others already drifting toward sleep. I should have been settling in too, but my eyes kept wandering. Not out of restlessness this time, but because of her. She moved with that same grace I'd noticed before, calm, precise, almost untouchable. And yet, the more I watched, the more I began to see the little cracks in that perfect surface. The way she tugged gently at the cuff of her sleeve, as though it never quite sat right. The faintest crease between her brows when she thought no one was looking. Even the way her smile sometimes lingered a second longer than necessary, as if she had learned to hold it there until people turned away. When she returned to my row with a tray of water, I caught the subtle tiredness in her eyes, the kind that comes not from one long day, but from years of long days. "Would you like some?" she asked, her tone measured and professional. I nodded, reaching out, and in the smallest of accidents my fingers brushed hers as I took the plastic cup. Just a second. Just enough. The contact was nothing, really. A routine exchange. But to me, it wasn't nothing. Her skin was warm, and in that fleeting moment, I felt the pulse of her humanity through the armor of her role. She didn't withdraw quickly. In fact, if anything, she hesitated, only a fraction, before letting go. Our eyes lifted at the same time. Hers were steady, but there was something beneath them, something she hadn't meant to reveal. Vulnerability. "Thank you," I said softly, holding her gaze longer than I should have. "You're welcome," she replied, but her voice carried a note gentler than before. Not rehearsed, not polished, real. She moved on, continuing down the aisle, but I noticed her hand shift to her scarf as she passed. A small adjustment, almost defensive, as though she needed to compose herself again. I leaned back in my seat, sipping the water slowly, more aware now of the quiet hum of the engines, the faint rustle of pages turning in the row behind me. But above it all, I kept replaying that moment, her hand against mine, the pause in her breath, the subtle shift in her expression. It was strange. Until then, she had been the picture of professionalism, someone who belonged in the uniform, untouchable and distant. But now, she seemed different. Realer. Human. And I realized something. Maybe she wore composure the way some people wear jewelry, carefully, proudly, but always heavy. And maybe, just maybe, someone noticing the weight of it was enough to make her falter. I set the cup down, my heart beating a little faster than it should for such a small thing. But the truth was, the flight no longer felt ordinary. The distance between us had shortened, if only by inches. And in those inches something delicate had begun to grow. The cabin settled into that peculiar stillness that only exists in the air. The hum of the engines was constant, steady, almost like a heartbeat beneath everything. Around me, people dozed off with their heads tilted against windows, headphones slipped over ears, books folded shut. And then, there she was again. She moved slowly down the aisle, not with the brisk efficiency of the boarding routine but with something quieter, unhurried. Her eyes scanned the rows, checking on passengers with a subtle attentiveness. When she reached my seat, I caught her gaze, not in passing this time, but in a way that seemed to hold. "Everything all right here?" she asked. Her tone was gentle, low enough that it felt like it belonged to me alone, not the entire row. I smiled, seizing the moment. "Actually, I was wondering if you had any book recommendations. Flights feel shorter when I get lost in a story." Her lips curved, the first real smile I'd seen that wasn't part of her uniform. "That depends," she said, leaning slightly closer, resting one hand lightly on the seat back in front of me. "Do you prefer the kind of story that makes time disappear, or the kind that makes you think about it more?" The way she phrased it, thoughtful, almost poetic, surprised me. She wasn't just going through motions. She was engaging, curious. I tilted my head. "Both, I guess. Sometimes I want to escape. Sometimes I want to feel like the story is holding up a mirror." Her eyes softened, and I noticed how different her voice sounded now. Lower, less practiced, carrying the weight of someone who had asked herself those same questions on long flights and in quiet hotel rooms. She mentioned a novel she'd read recently, her expression warming as she spoke. I didn't even know the author, but it didn't matter. The way she described the story was enough. Her hands moved as she spoke, fingertips brushing lightly against the headrest near me, as though she needed to anchor herself in that small space while opening up. I listened, not just to her words, but to the cadence of her voice. It was soft but steady, with a richness that lingered in the air. I realized then how much she must have longed for conversations like this, something real, beyond coffee or tea. Beyond. "Fasten your seatbelt. I think I'd like that book," I said when she finished. Her smile lingered this time, and for a moment she didn't step away. The space between us felt smaller, almost like the cabin had shrunk around us. Then someone rang the call button, and she straightened, slipping seamlessly back into her role. But before she left, she said quietly, "I'll write down the title for you before we land." It was such a simple promise. Yet it felt like more than a promise about a book. It felt like a thread, one she had placed between us, invisible but strong. As she walked away, I realized something I hadn't expected. She was no longer just the woman in uniform. She was a person with stories, with hidden layers, with a voice I wanted to hear again. And suddenly, the flight didn't feel long enough. The seatbelt sign flickered on with a soft chime. A voice came over the intercom, calm but clipped, reminding passengers to remain seated. Around me, I felt the slight shift in the air pressure as the plane began to dip and sway. Turbulence. A few passengers murmured nervously, their hands clutching armrests, but I stayed still, my eyes drifting toward her. She appeared from the galley, moving down the aisle with that practiced steadiness, even as the plane jolted. Her composure was remarkable, the kind born from years of experience, yet as she approached my row, a sudden jolt caused her to reach out instinctively. Her hand landed on my shoulder. It was brief, unplanned, but the contact was real. Her palm pressed firmly enough to steady herself, fingers curling lightly as the plane shook again. For a heartbeat, she leaned into me, close enough that I caught the faint scent of her perfume, something subtle and warm, like sandalwood and citrus. Her eyes met mine, and for that split second, she wasn't the untouchable professional. She was simply a woman, caught off balance, trusting me to anchor her. She laughed softly under her breath, almost embarrassed, as she steadied herself and drew her hand back. "Sorry," she murmured, though her voice carried more warmth than apology. "Don't be," I said quietly, my lips curving in a smile I couldn't suppress. "It's nice knowing you trust me to keep you steady." Her eyes lingered, as if weighing whether to respond. Then she shook her head with a faint smile, almost as if to dismiss the moment, though I could see in the flicker of her expression that she'd felt it too. She crouched slightly, balancing herself by holding the seat in front of mine. "Most people think we never get nervous," she said, her tone quieter now, almost confessional. "But sometimes the sky reminds you how small you really are." Her words hung between us, heavier than the turbulence itself. For the first time, she wasn't offering reassurance as part of her job. She was admitting something true, something vulnerable. I leaned closer, my voice matching her softness. "Maybe that's why you're so steady, because you've learned how to carry that feeling, even when it's there." Her gaze softened, and for a moment she seemed like she might say more. But the plane steadied, smoothing into calmer skies, and the moment passed. She rose, her composure settling back over her like a familiar coat. Still, as she moved on, she placed her hand briefly on my arm, not for balance this time, but as a quiet acknowledgement. A thank you without words. The engines droned on, the cabin returned to its hush, but something inside me had shifted. That fleeting moment, her touch, her honesty, had drawn us closer than 100 polite exchanges ever could. Because in her small confession, she had given me something rare, a glimpse of the woman behind the uniform, one who wasn't unshakable after all. And in the way her hand lingered on my arm, I felt she had allowed me, if only for a breath, to be her anchor in the sky. Night had folded itself over the plane. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow, and one by one, passengers slipped into sleep. The hum of the engines filled the quiet like a lullaby, steady and low. I should have closed my eyes too, but I couldn't. My thoughts kept circling back to her, the fleeting touches, the softness behind her composure, the way her voice changed when she spoke to me, low and unguarded. She was moving down the aisle again, slow, deliberate, as though she didn't want to disturb the cocoon of silence around us. Her steps were so light I barely heard them over the drone of the engines. I watched her without meaning to, my gaze following the way she leaned slightly to check on a sleeping passenger, her hands tucking a loose blanket edge. She carried herself with such quiet grace that it almost hurt to look away. And then it happened. She turned, caught my eyes. It wasn't just a passing glance. It was a pause. A moment suspended. In the dim light, her expression softened, and for the first time, she didn't hide it. She didn't mask it with professionalism or brush it away with a polite smile. She looked at me, truly looked. Something in my chest tightened. I couldn't move, couldn't even pretend to look elsewhere. Slowly she stepped closer, her movements careful, almost hesitant, as if she knew crossing this distance would change something between us. When she reached my row, she bent slightly, her voice no louder than a whisper. "Are you comfortable? Do you need anything?" It was the most ordinary question, but in that moment, it felt intimate. Her face was close, framed by the soft glow of the overhead light. Her hand rested lightly on the seat back beside mine, her fingers brushing the fabric so near that I could feel the air shift. I shook my head. "No. I'm fine." Better than fine. My words carried a weight I hadn't meant to reveal, but her eyes flickered, as if she understood. Silence settled between us, heavy yet delicate. Neither of us spoke, but the space itself seemed to hum with unspoken meaning. Her hand lingered on the seat, just a few inches from mine. I thought about closing that distance, just brushing my fingers against hers. But I didn't. The restraint was part of the moment, part of what made it ache in the best way. Finally, she drew in a quiet breath, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "All right," she said softly, though it sounded more like an acknowledgement than a dismissal. She moved away, continuing down the aisle, but her steps seemed slower now, as though she wasn't entirely ready to leave the moment behind. I leaned back in my seat, heart unsteady, eyes following her silhouette until it disappeared into the soft shadows of the cabin. And in that quiet space, I realized we hadn't touched, hadn't spoken of anything beyond the ordinary. Yet somehow, that look, that pause, felt more intimate than any embrace could have been. The captain's voice drifted over the intercom, smooth but distant. "We'll begin our descent shortly. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." The spell of the quiet night cabin broke. Passengers stirred awake, adjusting seats, stretching stiff arms. The muted stillness gave way to the sounds of zippers, buckles, and low voices. And her. She moved through the aisle one last time, her pace deliberate, her posture composed once again. The crisp professionalism had returned, the uniform not just on her body but wrapped around her demeanor. To anyone else, she was simply doing her job. But I knew better now. I had glimpsed the woman behind the mask, the softness she tried so carefully to conceal. Still, doubt crept in. Had I imagined it? Those long looks, the hesitations, the subtle touches? Maybe she was simply kind, simply attentive. Maybe I had been reading too much into gestures meant for every passenger. I sat there wrestling with my thoughts until she reached my row. She leaned in, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence, close enough that her perfume brushed faintly against me again. "Seatbelt fastened?" she asked softly, her tone light, practiced. I nodded, fumbling slightly with the buckle just to prolong the moment. "All secure." Her hand came down gently on my arm, not brisk, not functional. It was a touch that lingered, her fingertips resting for a breath too long, her thumb brushing lightly as though she didn't quite want to pull away. It was nothing anyone else would notice. But to me, it was everything. I looked up at her, meeting her gaze. For a moment, she didn't look away. Her eyes, dark and steady, held mine as though we were standing on a bridge neither of us had the courage to cross. Then, in the smallest of gestures, she gave me a smile. Not the polite, professional one I'd seen a dozen times that night. This one was quieter, almost sad, as if she too felt the weight of an ending she couldn't stop. She straightened slowly, her hand slipping from my arm with a softness that made the absence ache. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" I asked, voice low. Her eyes flickered, searching mine, before she gave a small shake of her head. "For being kind." And then she moved on, her attention shifting back to the aisle, to the 100 other small tasks waiting for her before the wheels touched ground. I sat back, heart tightening, a mix of warmth and ache washing through me. The descent had begun, not just for the plane but for whatever fragile thread had stretched between us in the sky. I told myself not to hope for more. That when the plane landed, she would walk away, and I'd return to my life with nothing but a memory of a woman who had been kind, graceful, and untouchably beautiful for a few fleeting hours. But the truth was harder to deny. I wanted more than a memory. The wheels touched the runway with a soft thud, the kind that shivered through the cabin and made everyone instinctively brace. A ripple of relief moved through the passengers, some clapped, some sighed, others simply reached for their phones, already half back in their lives on the ground. But for me, the world still felt suspended. I wasn't thinking about where I was headed or what came next. My thoughts were entirely on her. She moved gracefully through the final motions, her voice calm as she gave instructions, her presence once more wrapped in the armor of routine. To anyone else, she was the same as she had been at the start of the flight, efficient, untouchable, perfectly composed. And yet I had seen behind that. I had seen the pause in her smile, the softness in her voice, the warmth of her hand lingering on mine. I had seen the woman, not just the uniform. Passengers began to file out, stretching their legs, gathering bags from overhead bins. I waited, letting the crowd move ahead of me. Part of me wasn't ready to let go. I wanted the aisle to empty, the noise to fade, so that just for a few seconds longer, it could be her and me in this suspended world between sky and ground. When the last few travelers shuffled out, I stood slowly, gripping my bag but not moving. She was by the exit now, her posture poised, thanking each passenger with that familiar professional tone. But when her eyes found mine, something shifted. Her words caught in her throat for half a beat, and her smile. This one wasn't for anyone else. It was for me. I walked toward her, my steps slower than they needed to be, stretching the space between us. When I reached her, I set my bag down, just for a moment, and said softly, "Thank you? Not just for the flight, but for keeping me company tonight." Her expression faltered, in the best way. She wasn't expecting that, not spoken so plainly, not with the kind of sincerity that left no room for jest. "You're welcome," she replied, her voice quieter now, no longer the polished tone she had used for everyone else. It was her voice, real and warm. There was a pause, the kind that seemed to hold its breath. Then, with the smallest of gestures, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a small slip of paper, and pressed it gently into my hand. I looked down, a name, a number, nothing more. But her fingers lingered against mine as she let it go, her touch deliberate, unhurried. When I looked back up, her eyes held mine with a softness I would never forget. "Maybe one day," she whispered, "I'll take that seat beside you." And just like that, she stepped back, her composure settling around her again as the next crew member called her attention. I left the plane with my heart racing faster than when we first took off. Not because of the flight, but because of the woman who had turned a simple journey into something unforgettable. And as I walked through the terminal, her words echoed in me, steady and certain. "Maybe one day." 22.